Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today, we're exploring one of the most influential minds in economic thought, Adam Smith. Now, before you click away thinking this will be a dry economics lecture, let me assure you, it's not. Because Adam Smith wasn't just an economist, he was a philosopher, a rebel against outdated systems, and a brilliant mind of the Enlightenment whose ideas still shape the way our world works today. So, who was this guy? Adam Smith was a Scottish philosopher born in the year 1723 and lived until 1790. He was a key figure in what we now call the Scottish Enlightenment, which was basically Scotland's intellectual renaissance. You can think of it as a golden age of deep thinkers, debate clubs, and groundbreaking ideas. Smith stood out among these minds, and for good reason. He's considered the father of modern economics, not because he invented money or stocks, but because he revolutionized the way we think about wealth, work, and society. One of his most famous contributions is a book called The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. In it, Smith introduced major ideas like the division of labor and the invisible hand, concepts that became the foundation of capitalist thought. This wasn't just some niche book for scholars. It was a game changer, a blueprint for how economies could grow, thrive, and, ideally, serve the people within them. But this video isn't just about dry theories. We're going to uncover why historians care about Smith so much. It's not just what he wrote, but how he connected big ideas about morality, society, and the economy into one unified vision. Smith didn't just study markets. He studied people, and that's what makes him so fascinating. So get comfortable, stay curious, and let's dive into the world of Adam Smith. To understand Adam Smith, we have to step back and look at the world he was living in. The mid-1700s weren't just about powdered wigs and horse-drawn carriages. This was a time of major intellectual upheaval known as the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment wasn't just some fancy term historians throw around. It was a full-blown reimagining of how society should work. Thinkers across Europe were questioning everything: monarchies, religion, education, and most importantly for Smith, economics. People were turning away from superstition and blind tradition and embracing reason, logic, and science. It was all about understanding the world through observation and critical thinking. That might sound normal to us now, but at the time, it was revolutionary. In this environment, the old economic system called mercantilism started to crack. Mercantilism was obsessed with national wealth, trade surpluses, and hoarding gold. Governments tightly controlled commerce, using tariffs, colonialism, and state-sponsored monopolies to try and beat other nations in an economic arms race. It was like economic warfare dressed up in royal robes. But this approach was starting to feel outdated. Critics, including Smith, saw it as inefficient and, more importantly, unfair. Mercantilism didn't leave much room for individual freedom or innovation. It was all about what benefited the crown, not the common person. Enter classical liberalism. This was the big new idea brewing in the Enlightenment, pushed by thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and eventually Adam Smith. They believed in property rights, personal liberty, and free markets. Not chaos, but freedom within a framework. They argued that economies work best not when governments micromanage everything, but when people are free to trade, produce, and innovate with minimal interference. Smith would take these ideas and run with them. He didn't just accept the Enlightenment worldview, he embodied it. And as we'll see, he used its principles to reshape how we think about value, work, and society itself. Let's zoom in now and get to know the man behind the ideas. Adam Smith was born in the year 1723 in a small coastal town called Kirkcaldy, in Scotland. He was raised by his mother, who was widowed shortly after his birth. She played a huge role in shaping his early life, especially when it came to his education. She believed deeply in learning, and that passion clearly rubbed off on young Adam. He wasn't out chasing sheep or fishing like other kids. He was reading, thinking, and probably asking way too many questions. He entered the University of Glasgow at the age of just 14. Yes, 14. And this wasn't just some basic school, it was one of the leading centers of Enlightenment thought at the time. There, Smith studied moral philosophy and came under the influence of a brilliant professor named Francis Hutcheson. Hutcheson's ideas about ethics and human nature would stick with Smith for the rest of his life. Smith continued his education at Balliol College at Oxford, but he wasn't exactly thrilled with the experience. In fact, he criticized Oxford pretty openly for its lack of intellectual curiosity. According to him, many of the professors were just coasting, more interested in collecting paychecks than pushing the boundaries of knowledge. He wanted more ideas, more challenges, more engagement. Eventually, Smith became a professor himself, holding a post at the University of Glasgow. He taught logic and moral philosophy, And he wasn't just reading from dusty books. He was shaping new generations of thinkers, laying the groundwork for ideas that would outlive him by centuries. And during this time, he formed a close intellectual friendship with none other than David Hume, another titan of Enlightenment philosophy. So before he ever wrote about invisible hands or free markets, Adam Smith was already a major voice in philosophy, deeply invested in questions of morality, justice, and how societies function. And as we'll see in the next section, those philosophical roots would never really leave him. Before Adam Smith became famous for economic theories, he published a different kind of book. In 1759, he released The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, I know that title sounds like it belongs on a dusty bookshelf somewhere, but trust me, this work was the heart of Smith's thinking. If the wealth of nations was the brain, this was the soul. In this book, Smith argued something pretty profound, that morality doesn't come from rules written in stone, or from government laws alone. Instead, he believed that moral judgment comes from something much more human, our capacity for sympathy. Not sympathy in the pitying sense, but in the ability to imagine what others are feeling, to see ourselves in their shoes. He said this ability is what allows society to function in a fair and stable way. Smith introduced the idea of the impartial spectator. Imagine there's a version of you that watches everything you do from the outside, judging your actions as if it were someone else. According to Smith, this internal moral compass, our imagined audience, is what keeps us in line and helps us make ethical decisions. It's not just about laws and punishments. It's about living in a society where we care how others perceive our behavior. This book also laid the foundation for Smith's later economic theories. He didn't see the market as some cold, mechanical machine. He saw it as part of a broader moral system. He believed that markets could only function properly when guided by ethical behavior and social trust. So the theory of moral sentiments wasn't just a warm-up for the wealth of nations. It was a crucial part of the puzzle. It told us what kind of people we need to be in order for society and the economy to work well. Smith's vision wasn't just about wealth. It was about harmony, justice, and shared moral understanding. Now we arrive at the big one. In 1776, Adam Smith published an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Don't worry, we'll just call it The Wealth of Nations from here on out. This was the book that earned him the title Father of Modern Economics, and honestly, it earned it for good reason. This wasn't just a textbook or a collection of theories. It was a sweeping, detailed exploration of how economies actually work. At over 900 pages, it's dense, but it's also brilliant. In it, Smith tackled everything from productivity to taxation to the structure of society itself. But at the heart of it all was one major idea, that individual self-interest, when channeled properly, could lead to collective good. That's where the famous phrase, invisible hand, comes in. Smith argued that when people pursue their own gain, whether they're baking bread, forging iron, or running a shop, they end up contributing to the greater good of society, even if that wasn't their intention. In other words, by working to improve their own lives, they're also improving the economy as a whole. But let's be clear, Smith wasn't praising greed. He was describing a system where, under the right conditions, personal motivation could lead to social benefit. That's a lot different than saying, just be selfish and everything will work out. He also introduced the idea of the division of labor, breaking down production into specialized tasks to increase efficiency. He famously used the example of a pin factory. One person trying to make a pin from scratch would struggle, but if 10 people each mastered one step in the process, they could make thousands of pins a day. This wasn't just about productivity, it was a way to understand how modern economies scale and grow. So The Wealth of Nations wasn't just revolutionary for its time, it still required reading for economists, historians, and anyone who wants to understand how markets really work. It took the abstract world of economic activity and gave it structure, clarity, and meaning. Alright, now that we've introduced The Wealth of Nations, let's dig into some of the key concepts that make this book such a cornerstone of economic thought. These ideas weren't just revolutionary back then, they still shape how we think about economics today. First up is the division of labor. This is the idea that breaking down complex tasks into smaller, specialized roles increases productivity. Remember that pin factory example I mentioned earlier? That's Smith's go-to illustration. Instead of one person doing every step and making a handful of pins, you divide the work. One person draws the wire, another cuts it, another sharpens it, and suddenly, you've got tens of thousands of pins a day. It sounds obvious now, but at the time, this idea explained why modern economies could grow so much faster than traditional ones. Next, let's talk about the invisible hand. This one gets thrown around a lot, often by people who haven't actually read Smith. So here's what he really meant. When individuals act in their own self-interest, say, starting a business to earn a living, they unintentionally benefit others. Their goods and services contribute to the overall economy, create jobs, and meet demand. The idea is that a decentralized market, guided by individual choices, can lead to efficient outcomes, as if an invisible hand were directing everything. It's poetic, really. Then we have free markets and competition. Smith argued that when businesses compete, consumers benefit, prices stay fair, quality improves, and innovation thrives. He believed that government should protect against fraud and enforce contracts, but it shouldn't interfere in the natural flow of trade unless absolutely necessary. Let people buy and sell freely, and the economy will find its balance. But, and this is crucial, Smith wasn't a champion of chaos. He didn't believe in zero regulation. He believed in rules that support the market, not control it. That's an important distinction that often gets lost in translation. So to recap, the division of labor makes production more efficient, the invisible hand helps individual choices lead to societal benefit, and free markets thrive when competition is allowed to flourish. These ideas are the pillars of Smith's legacy, and they've influenced everything from capitalism to public policy ever since. Let's dive deeper into one of Adam Smith's most famous illustrations, what he called the division of labor. And to explain it, he used something unexpectedly small and simple, the humble pin. Imagine you walk into a pin factory in the 1700s. Now, making a pin might sound like a quick and easy task, right? Just a bit of wire and a sharp end? Not quite. According to Smith, there are actually around 18 distinct steps involved in creating a single pin. That includes drawing out the wire, straightening it, cutting it, sharpening the point, attaching the head, and so on. If one person had to do all of that alone, every single step, they might be able to make a handful of pins in a day, maybe 10 at most. But Smith observed something remarkable. When the labor was divided, when each worker specialized in just one or two steps of the process, productivity skyrocketed. He said that 10 workers, each focusing on a specific task, could produce over 48,000 pins in a single day. From 10 pins per person to thousands per day, just by organizing the work differently. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about unlocking human potential. Smith believed that specialization allowed workers to get really good at their tasks, reduce wasted effort, and streamline the entire operation. The result? More goods, lower prices, and a better standard of living for society as a whole. But he also recognized a downside. When workers are confined to just one small, repetitive task, their work can become dull and even dehumanizing. He warned that overspecialization could turn people into machines, losing sight of the bigger picture. That's something we still wrestle with today, especially in factories, corporate jobs, and even modern tech. So, the pin factory wasn't just a clever example. It was Smith's way of showing how organization and structure could massively improve productivity, while also hinting at the social consequences of reducing human labor to repetitive motions. Now let's talk about one of the most famous and most misunderstood phrases in all of economics, the invisible hand. People love to throw this term around, especially when they're talking about free markets or capitalism. But what did Adam Smith actually mean by it? Spoiler alert, it's not some magical force that guarantees everything will turn out perfect. It's more subtle, and honestly, more fascinating than that. Smith used the phrase "the invisible hand" to describe how individuals, by pursuing their own self-interest, can unintentionally contribute to the overall good of society. Let's break that down. Imagine a baker who wants to earn a living. They don't wake up thinking, how can I make society better today? No, they just want to sell bread, make money, and support their family. But by doing that, by making good bread at a fair price, they feed the community, create jobs, and maybe even inspire competition that leads to better quality and lower prices. That's the invisible hand at work. The baker isn't trying to help others, but they do, simply by acting in their own rational self-interest. Smith argued that in a well-functioning market, where people are free to trade and compete, this kind of unintentional benefit can emerge naturally. Now here's the key part. Smith didn't think this invisible hand was perfect or infallible. It's not some economic superhero that fixes every problem. He recognized that markets could fail, that monopolies could form, and that greed without moral grounding could cause real harm. That's why his earlier work on ethics, the theory of moral sentiments, is so important. The invisible hand works best when people are acting not just for profit, but also with a sense of fairness and justice. So when people quote Smith and say, just trust the invisible hand, they're often missing the point. Smith's version wasn't blind faith in the market, it was a careful observation of how human behavior, guided by self-interest and social norms, could lead to positive outcomes when the system is set up properly. Alright, so now that we understand the invisible hand and how self-interest can benefit society, the next logical question is, what role should the government play? Should it step back entirely and just let the market do its thing? Or is there a need for some oversight? Adam Smith had a clear but balanced answer. He was a champion of free markets, yes, but that didn't mean he thought government should disappear. In fact, he believed government had some very specific and important responsibilities in making sure the market actually worked the way it was supposed to. First, Smith argued that the government should protect property rights and enforce contracts. Without those things, no one would trust the system. If you couldn't be sure that someone would pay you after you sold them goods, or if your business could be stolen from without consequences, the whole idea of a functioning economy would collapse. So, legal structure and justice weren't optional, they were essential. Second, he believed the government should provide what he called public goods. These are things that the private sector has little incentive to produce because they're not easily profitable, but society still needs them. Think about roads, bridges, education, and defense. Smith knew that these services benefit everyone but don't really lend themselves to individual profit, so he believed it was up to the state to step in. He also warned against monopolies and unfair trade practices. If one company dominates an industry and drives out all competition, it can set prices as high as it wants and deliver poor service, because customers have no alternatives. Smith knew that for a market to stay healthy, it had to have competition, and sometimes, that meant the government had to regulate just enough to keep things fair and open. So yes, Smith supported free markets, but not the kind of wild, unchecked capitalism that ignores consequences. He believed in freedom within a structure, a system where people could trade and compete freely, but within a framework that ensured justice, transparency, and opportunity for all. That's a more thoughtful and nuanced take than what we often hear today, and it shows that Smith was thinking deeply about both economic efficiency and social stability. To really appreciate Adam Smith's ideas, we've got to understand what he was pushing back against. And that, my friends, was mercantilism, the dominant economic philosophy of Europe for centuries before Smith came along. So what was mercantilism all about? Picture a game of Monopoly, but instead of trying to build wealth through smart investments, everyone is obsessed with hoarding as much money as possible while stopping others from getting any. That's basically mercantilism. It was all about stockpiling gold and silver, maximizing exports, and minimizing imports. Nations believed that wealth was finite, like there was only one pie, and if someone else got a bigger slice, you got less. So governments imposed tariffs, restricted trade, and heavily regulated their economies to keep money flowing in and out as they saw fit. They granted monopolies to favored companies, controlled colonies to get cheap raw materials, and kept foreign competition out as much as possible. It was a zero-sum game. Someone had to lose for someone else to win. But Adam Smith came along and said, hold on a second. What if wealth isn't fixed? What if, through specialization, innovation, and free exchange, we can actually grow the pie? What if two countries trading with each other doesn't make one richer at the expense of the other, but instead benefits both? That was Smith's revolutionary idea. In his vision of free trade, countries shouldn't fear imports, they should welcome them. If another nation can produce something cheaper or better, let them. In return, you specialize in what you're good at, and both sides gain. This idea of mutual benefit through voluntary exchange turned mercantilist thinking completely on its head. Smith argued that when markets are open, and individuals and nations are free to trade without unnecessary restrictions, everyone wins. Resources are used more efficiently, competition drives innovation, and consumers enjoy better goods at lower prices. So, while mercantilism was based on fear and control, Smith's model was based on trust in human nature, cooperation, and the potential for progress. He saw trade not as economic warfare, but as a powerful engine for prosperity and peace. Now we're getting into one of Adam Smith's more complex and debated ideas, the labor theory of value. Don't worry, we'll break it down in a way that actually makes sense. Smith believed that the value of a good, what it's really worth, comes from the amount of labor that goes into producing it. In other words, the more time and effort it takes to make something, the more valuable it should be. This wasn't just about the final product, but the whole process. From mining the metal, to shaping the parts, to assembling the item, every step of labor added to its value. He illustrated this idea with examples from early societies, where people traded things like deer for beaver. If it usually took twice as long to hunt a beaver as it did a deer, then naturally, one beaver would be worth 2 deer. Labor was the common measuring stick. Now, it's important to note that Smith didn't believe this always worked perfectly in more advanced, capitalist economies. He recognized that things get more complicated when landowners, capitalists, and wages enter the picture. For example, someone might own land or machinery that contributes to production, and those things also have to be factored into the final price of a good. So, while labor was still central to value, Smith saw it as part of a broader mix once economies became more complex. Still, this idea, that labor is the source of value, was hugely influential. It became a foundation for later thinkers like David Ricardo and even Karl Marx, though they took it in very different directions. What Smith was really getting at is this: work matters. Labor isn't just a cost, it's what gives goods their value. And in a just economy, that labor should be recognized and rewarded fairly. So whether it's crafting a tool or coding software, Smith wanted us to understand that behind every product is someone's time, skill, and effort, and that's something we shouldn't overlook. Alright, here's a side of Adam Smith that a lot of people overlook. We usually think of him as the philosopher of markets, the invisible hand guy, the economics legend, but Smith was also, in many ways, a historian, especially when it came to how economies evolve over time. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith didn't just explain how markets work in his present day. He traced the stages of economic development throughout history, showing how human societies moved from one economic system to another. He believed that understanding this progression was essential to understanding how nations grow and how wealth is created. So what were these stages? First, Smith talked about the age of hunters. Early humans survived by hunting animals and gathering plants. There was no private property, and wealth was pretty much measured in food and tools. It was simple, raw survival. Then came the age of shepherds, or pastoralism. People began domesticating animals, moving around with herds, and acquiring more possessions. This was when property and inequality started to emerge, because people could now own more than they needed just to survive. After that came the age of agriculture, where humans settled, farmed the land, and built more permanent communities. This allowed for food surpluses, population growth, and the rise of complex societies. It also gave birth to land ownership, social hierarchies, and early governments. Finally, we reach the age of commerce, Smith's own time. This was the era of trade, cities, and markets. People were no longer just producing to survive, they were producing for exchange. Commerce brought about specialization, innovation, and large-scale economic cooperation. Smith saw this progression as natural, but not necessarily smooth. He knew that every stage came with challenges, inequality, corruption, even war. But he also believed that the spread of commerce could bring greater prosperity and freedom, especially when guided by reason, moral values, and well-structured institutions. So when we call Smith a historian of economic development, we mean that he didn't just invent new ideas, he looked back, connected the dots, and tried to understand how we got here in the first place. He wanted to know not just how economies worked, but why they worked the way they did, and how they could work better in the future. Now let's return to a work we touched on earlier, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759. If The Wealth of Nations was Smith's big economic masterpiece, this book was the emotional and philosophical foundation beneath it. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith asked a very human question: why do we care about doing the right thing, even when no one's watching? And his answer came down to one powerful idea: sympathy. Now when Smith says sympathy, he doesn't just mean feeling sorry for someone. He means the ability to imagine ourselves in someone else's situation. He believed we have a natural tendency to put ourselves in others' shoes. This inner sense of connection, what he called our moral sentiments, is what creates order in society. It's how we learn right from wrong, not because someone told us, but because we want to be seen as fair, reasonable, and just. He introduced the idea of the impartial spectator, an imaginary figure we all carry around in our heads. It's the version of ourselves that looks at our behavior from the outside, asking, if someone else saw what I'm doing, would they think it was fair? Would they approve? This internal judge keeps us in check. It helps us navigate our actions with a sense of conscience, even when the law isn't involved. Smith believed this moral instinct was just as important to society as any legal system. In fact, he thought the invisible hand of the market wouldn't work at all without this kind of internal moral compass. People don't live in spreadsheets, they live in communities. And those communities need trust, decency, and empathy to function. What's fascinating is how Smith saw no contradiction between his work on morality and his later work on economics. To him, they were two sides of the same coin. You can't build a thriving economy without a foundation of mutual respect and ethical behavior. So when people treat Adam Smith like a cold-hearted capitalist who only cared about profits, they're missing the full picture. His moral philosophy came first, and it stayed with him. It reminded him, and us, that economics is ultimately about people, and that how we treat each other matters. Now we reach a turning point, not just in Smith's legacy, but in world history. Let's talk about his influence on the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith didn't invent the Industrial Revolution, but his ideas helped lay the intellectual groundwork for it. His theories about productivity, specialization, free markets, and self-interest arrived at just the right moment, when technological innovation was about to explode and economies were shifting from farming to factories. Remember his idea of the division of labor from the pin factory example? That wasn't just a clever metaphor, it became a guiding principle in industrial production. Factories during the Industrial Revolution didn't operate randomly. They were organized into specialized tasks, just like Smith described. Instead of a single craftsman making a product from start to finish, workers were assigned specific roles in an assembly line. It was faster, more efficient, and much more profitable. Smith's support for free markets and limited government interference also resonated with industrialists. Entrepreneurs used his ideas to argue for fewer trade restrictions, less regulation, and open competition. They believed that if individuals and businesses were free to pursue profit, the economy would grow, and they were right, at least in terms of production and innovation. His work provided a kind of moral and intellectual permission slip for capitalism to grow at scale. He gave thinkers, leaders, and business owners a way to understand and justify the changes that were happening all around them. And with the rise of mechanized production, urbanization, and international trade, his ideas became more relevant than ever. But here's the thing, Smith also warned about some of the dangers we saw during the Industrial Revolution. He cautioned against exploitation, monopolies, and the dehumanizing effects of extreme specialization. He believed that without a moral foundation and smart institutions, markets could drift into harmful territory. So while Smith's theories helped fuel the engines of the Industrial Revolution, he also offered a subtle warning: economic progress should never come at the cost of human dignity. A society chasing wealth must still ask, at what cost, and for whose benefit? As we look beyond Adam Smith's lifetime, his influence only grows. From the late 1700s through the 1900s, Smith's ideas traveled far and wide, shaping not just economic theory but the very structure of modern societies. In the late 18th century, right after The Wealth of Nations was published, Smith's ideas found a ready audience among politicians and thinkers across Europe and the Americas. His timing was perfect. The world was changing. Empires were rising and falling. The American colonies were declaring independence, and revolutions were challenging old monarchies. People were hungry for new ideas about freedom, prosperity, and how to organize society. Smith offered just that. By the 19th century, his theories were being taught in universities and debated in parliaments. Economists like David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill built on his work, developing more technical theories about labor, wages, and trade. Meanwhile, political leaders began using Smith's ideas to push for lower tariffs, freer markets, and smaller government roles in economic affairs. His thinking became central to what we now call classical economics. In the 20th century, Smith's influence was still going strong, but it took on new dimensions. As the world faced massive events like the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the rise of communism, debates about capitalism and economic freedom became more urgent. Smith's vision of free markets and individual liberty was often held up as a counterpoint to centralized planning and authoritarian control. During the Cold War, especially in the West, Smith was celebrated as a hero of capitalism. His name was invoked in policy debates, economic textbooks, and political speeches. Leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan referenced his work to justify free market reforms and deregulation. Even today, you'll hear his ideas echoed in conversations about taxes, trade, and the role of government. But here's what's fascinating. Through all of this, people have often cherry-picked pieces of Smith's thought to support their agendas. Some focused only on his praise of self-interest and free markets, while ignoring his deep concern for morality, justice, and the well-being of society. Smith's legacy is not just a tool for economists, it's a lens for understanding the evolution of modern life. His impact shaped the economic rules we live by, and his ideas are still at the heart of major debates about fairness, freedom, and the purpose of progress. And here we are, at the end of our journey through the life and legacy of Adam Smith. But hopefully, you've come to see that this wasn't just a story about economics. It was a story about people, about society, and about the values that hold it all together. Adam Smith wasn't just a champion of markets, he was a believer in human nature. He saw that people are complex. Yes, we chase our own interests, but we also care about fairness, reputation, and doing the right thing. He believed that economies work best not when people act like machines, but when they act like humans, with all the strengths and flaws that come with that. His vision was never just about wealth, it was about creating a society where productivity and prosperity are balanced by empathy and ethics, where the invisible hand of the market is guided by the inner voice of conscience, and where progress is measured not just in profits, but in the well-being of real people. So whether you're studying economics, history, politics, or just trying to understand how the world around you works, Adam Smith still has something to teach us. His ideas are timeless because they ask the big questions: what motivates us? What do we owe each other? And how do we build systems that reflect our best selves, not just our most efficient ones? Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're curious about the hidden stories behind other world-changing thinkers and moments in history, check out our other videos. There's a lot more where this came from. See you in the next one.